Nero Wolfe and the broken glass that hid the body. I was halfway through convincing the morning mail that it could live a full and meaningful life in the wastebasket when the doorbell put in for overtime. Fritz was fussing in the kitchen about a sauce that refused to be French, and Wolfe was upstairs with his orchids and therefore unreachable for anything short of an earthquake or an amendment to the Constitution repealing beer. Theodore had taken the newspaper upstairs as if orchids read the sports page. The brownstone was breathing its usual air, warm, dignified, and allergic to interruptions. I opened the door to a woman who looked as if she had crossed a crowded street against traffic, and arrived surprised there wasn't a single scratch. She was 35 by strict arithmetic, and less by a biased jury, with a coat that wanted to be rainproof and eyes that wanted to tell the truth quicker than her mouth would allow. She held a flat grey archival box against her chest as if it might object. "I'm Lorna Vale," she said, and followed the name with a quick inhalation the way some people make the sign of the cross. "Mr. Nero Wolfe, is he?" "Cultivating phalaenopsis," I told her. "It's their visiting hour. You've heard the sermon. If it's not blood or the Board of Health, we can try again at 11. Meanwhile, I'm Goodwin." "I know who you are." The corners of her mouth twitched. "I'm chief conservator at the Glasstown Institute." She nudged the box, lowering her voice like it was an accomplice. "This is what I need him for." I looked at the box. It wasn't bleeding. "If it's a painting, I warn you, he's picky about wall space." "It's glass," she said. "Then you should be in fine health. Come along." I got her into the office, set her in the red leather chair that has comforted more jitter than a citywide coffee shortage, and relieved her of the box. It had the weight that says serious paper or unserious rocks. She watched me set it on Wolfe's desk like I was balancing a child on a windowsill. "What's the specific ailment?" I asked. "Chipped conscience? Shattered alibi?" "Something went missing," she said. "Then something else went missing to make it look like nothing had. And last night someone sent me this." She nodded at the box again. "It was on my stoop when I got home." "All right," I said, and moved to the safe for a shiny envelope knife because showmanship is part of the fee. "Mr. Wolfe will want provenance, motives, and whether your institution would prefer a quiet solution or one that wakes up your donors. But I can tell you now, we charge extra for metaphors." She took that well. "We can pay the fee, or the Institute can. I'm not sure which is smarter. Perhaps Mr. Wolfe will advise." "Not until he can inspect you like a strange orchid and decide whether to buy the plant or the pot." I slid the lid off the box. Inside, nestled in black foam, was a pane of glass the size of a paperback, irregular on two edges and clean on the other two where it had once joined neighbors. It wasn't transparent the way glass is supposed to be. It was the milky, lightly greened sort you get in old windows. Across the surface, spider webbing like frost seen from a thin angle ran a network of cracks. At the center, a thumbprint of something, putty, had been pressed and then scraped, leaving a crescent of residue. I've handled messages that arrived with teeth marks, lipstick, and once a small smear of gravy, but this was new. A shard delivered to a conservator. If it wanted to send a valentine, it had picked the right mailbox. "What exactly am I looking at?" I asked. "In the East Gallery of the Institute," she said, her hands clasping one another like two strangers forcing a friendship. "We've had an exhibit on the history of urban glassmaking. Bottles, window panes, stained glass fragments, and several larger architectural pieces. A transom from a 1901 townhouse, a section of a ferry terminal fanlight from the 1890s, and, most prominently, a salvaged bay window from a notorious tenement fire." "Notorious how?" 13 people died." She didn't flinch. "It was an arson that set off reforms. The press loved it, the way the press loves anything that looks like justice after it's too late to interfere." "You said was, past tense." She nodded. 3 days ago, We discovered that one of the smaller panes in that bay window had been replaced with modern glass. Only someone who knows the behavior of 19th century soda-lime glass would notice. It rolls light differently, and the surface shows a certain wear. It's a conservator's trick to see it. I saw it. And not only replaced, someone had fitted the fake pane so skillfully, the old leading hadn't been disturbed. That took time, tools, access. You have suspects with keys and patience. I have colleagues, she said, and I admired her accuracy. We checked the rest of the assemblage. No other substitutions. But then, last night this arrived. She looked at the shard in my hands. It's from the original pane. The break is right. The thickness is right. And that residue, old glazing compound, it hasn't fully oxidized in the core. It was sheltered from light and air for a long time. Where's the rest? If I knew, she said, I would not be here. You think it's a ransom, I said. Someone stole your glass and is sending you the finger. I think someone is trying to make me complicit. The note that came with it. She fished in her coat and produced a smaller envelope, ivory, with the flap sliced clean. Inside was a card, the kind expensive stationers recommend for apologies and inheritances. On it, printed by a professional who liked clarity and disliked style, was, "It hid the body." Cute, I said. It's cruel, she said. And it's wrong. The bodies were found in the stairwell, not behind a window. So the sentence is a riddle or a lie. That's progress. I tilted the shard, and light borrowed the spider web and made it glitter. Which of your colleagues would love you enough to torment you? She held my gaze. I'm not a fool, Mr. Goodwin. I know what you're really asking. There's Dr. Whitaker, the curator who wants my job but would never do anything as vulgar as earn it. There's Peter Blanche, our exhibitions manager. He's clever with his hands and less clever with his girlfriends. There's Felicia Crane, a private donor liaison who calculates human behavior in denominations of $1,000. There's also our security chief, Denny Jabarian, who has the resigned look of a man paid to watch people touch what they shouldn't. And there's my boss, Director Daphne Croft, who smiles at committees like a saint of lost causes. Any of them could have access, but only some of them would know what to steal and how to hide it. You realize you just wrote the seating chart for a fine afternoon at our place. If Mr. Wolfe accepts, she said. I confess I'm not here merely as a professional. There's personal pressure. Someone has been in my apartment. You report it? Her eyes did a private calculation. No, nothing was taken. A drawer was arranged differently. A note I keep in a book. The corner was creased. Someone, was there long enough to put this box on the stoop, ring, and vanish. I thought of calling the police. Then I thought of the scandal, if it becomes the Institute scandal. And then I thought of how Mr. Wolfe hates leaving his house. It seemed sympathetic. A recommendation has never been written with a softer knife. I replaced the lid. The rate is the rate, payable in advance. If Mr. Wolfe agrees, he may also insist on half the Institute coming to him and the other half staying away. Don't be alarmed. That's diplomacy as we practice it. At 11 sharp, I heard the upstairs steps that mean Theodore has been told the orchids are safe without him. Wolfe entered the office with his morning complexion and the sort of patience you can only import. He gave me a look that asked if I had been reckless with anything important, like money or adjectives, and then glanced at our guest. Miss Vale, I said, this is Mr. Wolfe, who is to glass as the sun is to a magnifying lens, if he chooses to be. Wolfe grunted, tilted his head at the box, and oozed into his chair. He made the desk look like a raft. Miss Vale, you are punctual. Mr. Goodwin has been impertinent. Efficient, she said. That is a form of impertinence. Your profession? She repeated it. He gestured with 2 fingers, and I set the box before him and removed the lid. Wolfe bent forward the smallest measurable degree. He does not handle evidence unless it can be eaten. but he gives it a look that has been known to wilt self-respect. "Mr. Goodwin tells me," he said after a moment, "that your institution owns a window associated with a fire that killed 13. "Yes. And that one pane has been surreptitiously replaced, and the original supplied, in part, with an insolent legend." She nodded. Wolfe's eyes closed. "It is not prayer, it is inventory." "Your assumption," he said, "is that the thief is both expert and intimate, and that the message is for you, not for the Institute. That is my fear." "Fear." He opened his eyes. "Your fear is sound. Why have you involved me and not the police?" "Because they will ask for an inventory and a timetable we cannot afford to make public," she said, "and because the person who replaced the glass had to be invited to do it. Mr. Wolfe, this is either a private humiliation or a private warning. I can play conservator to both objects and egos, but I am out of my depth when the object is me." He allowed himself a small nod. "Conservators are the physicians of the inanimate. You require triage." He flicked the card with a pinky. "This line, the body hid behind glass." He did not repeat it. He corrected it. "There is an insinuation. Does your window, Miss Vale, have a documented provenance from the building where the fire occurred?" "Yes. It was removed during demolition. We have the records." "Do you have the records?" he said. "Or does the Institute?" Her mouth tightened. "The Institute." He turned to me. "Archie." "Saul." "Saul?" I asked. "Yes," he said, and his eyes moved toward the beer he would get at 1 o'clock as if appointing it deputy. "We will require Mr. Panzer's intelligence on the Institute's internal arrangements and its friends. Among the names you will take from Miss Vale will be persons you already dislike." "That's efficient," I said. "The list is warm." He looked again at Miss Vale. "I will accept the case. The retainer is $25,000. She exhaled. Yes, I can have a check this afternoon." "You will have it now," he said, and his eyelids descended as if the matter bored him. "I assent to your personal payment, not the Institute's. If it becomes necessary to involve the Institute, our arrangement will change, and our rate will increase." She didn't argue, which put her ahead of about 98% of humanity. She produced a checkbook with an institution's logo on it, and then, catching Wolfe's look, exchanged it for a plain one from her purse. She wrote with the deliberate strokes of someone who had practiced writing numbers she didn't want to think about. I gave the paper its proper home and the bank its future chore. "Now," Wolfe said, "names, titles, relationships, enmities, and a detailed schedule of who has had access to the East Gallery in the last month. You will then deliver to me, via Mr. Goodwin, a complete set of photographs of the bay window before this week and after. High resolution. The leading detail where the replaced pane is seated in particular. I can have that by this evening. You will have it to Mr. Goodwin by 3. He settled, having moved more than anyone should before lunch. In addition, you will write for me a description of what you mean by "it rolls light differently." Describe the difference as if you were instructing a blind man who distrusts you. She blinked. All right. And this residue. He bent the famous head a hair. When glazing compound ages, it shrinks. It separates from the iris, yes? This smear. Was it applied recently and then scraped? If so, the assailant intended to give you a clue you could understand. A token of intimacy. Did anyone besides you see that phrase? The card. No, I hid it. I shouldn't have brought it, but it is well that you did. Mr. Goodwin will return you to your routines with the admonition that you must not confess to anyone that the substitution has been discovered. You will instead increase your vigilance in an obvious and unthreatening way. Assign an intern to learn by observing in the East Gallery. Change a guard shift under pretext of fatigue. Do not accuse. Do not hint. You expect them to move, she said. I expect them to think you are timid. That is the lever. He closed his eyes again, this time in appetite. It was the look of a man imagining an omelette. Archie. I had the pad ready. Yes, sir. You will go with Miss Vale to the Institute and meet with her director privately. You will inform the director that this is a discreet inquiry into the plausibility of a theft that has not in fact occurred. Use that word, plausible. You will say the inquiry is undertaken by Miss Vale in her personal capacity to preempt reputational harm to the Institute. You will observe the director's nostrils. I love a day that comes with an anatomical checklist, I said. Then you will request, as a hypothetical exercise, the Institute's procedures for loaning objects to private collectors, and you will ask for a list of donors who have both insured and not insured items they have promised to the Institute. You will ask for it again when you are told it cannot be compiled. Miss Vale's fingers tightened without making a fist. You think this is about donors? I think the sentence is either a puzzle or true, Wolfe said. If true, then a body was hidden behind glass, and not in 1901. If a puzzle, it points, which is to say, it points to money. Everything points to money, I observed. Not my dinner, he said. That points to heaven. She stood, and the chair's leather sighed as if it wanted her to stay. Mr. Wolfe, thank you. He opened his eyes, and for a moment there was something almost like sympathy animating them. Miss Vale, you preserve, that is honorable. We will endeavor to preserve you. After she left, taking her box and leaving a perfume memory of something honest, Wolfe reached for the bell cord. Fritz answered with the concern of a man interrupted mid-interpretation of a Béarnaise. Beer, Wolfe said, and call Saul Panzer. Then, Mr. Goodwin, go with Miss Vale. Warriors leave. Priests remain. Fine, I said, and if I find a body behind a window? Open the curtains, he said, and shut his eyes. Miss Lorna Vale and I made it from the brownstone to the Glasstown Institute without incident, though I couldn't shake the feeling she was rehearsing answers to questions Wolfe hadn't asked yet. She sat in the cab straight-backed, with her hands folded in her lap like a student preparing for an oral exam. When I tried to lighten things by asking whether conservators got combat pay, she gave me a smile that was more faint acknowledgement than agreement. If she had secrets, and Wolfe had already wagered she did, they were tucked tighter than Fritz's napkin folds. The Institute was housed in a converted marble bank that had decided, sometime in its second career, that culture paid better than compound interest. The facade had Corinthian columns tall enough to make even Wolfe feel undersized, and the kind of brass-trimmed doors that advertised donors with names carved deeper than history. Inside, the place smelled like polished stone and ambition. Staffers drifted through the lobby with the studied expressions of people who knew the difference between glass, made in 1820 and in 1830, and wanted you to ask. I didn't. We headed straight to the director's office. Miss Vale had phoned ahead, arranging it so Daphne Croft would see us without witnesses. That suited Wolfe's directive fine, and it meant I got to appreciate a waiting room whose furnishings were designed to prove restraint was more expensive than excess. A receptionist in horn-rimmed glasses asked our names, tapped something into a ledger with old-fashioned dignity, and sent us through to the inner sanctum. Daphne Croft rose from behind a walnut desk that could have moonlighted as a runway for small planes. She was mid-40s, trim, with a face you could picture smiling at fundraisers over champagne without once spilling a drop. Her grey suit was cut like armor, her voice pitched low but firm. She greeted Miss Vale with professional warmth, then glanced at me as though trying to place my function, messenger, bodyguard, or both. Director Croft, Lorna said. This is Archie Goodwin, assistant to Mr. Nero Wolfe. He's conducting a private inquiry on my behalf. That last part landed like a carefully planted mine. Croft's eyebrows moved a fraction before her mouth did. Private inquiry? About what, Lorna? I gave her Wolfe's chosen phrasing, smooth as upholstery. Miss Vale has engaged us to investigate the plausibility of a theft that has not occurred. The object in question remains in place. This is preemptive, to protect the Institute's reputation should anyone claim otherwise. Nothing is being reported to the police at this time." Croft's gaze shifted from Lorna back to me, her eyes sharp and probing. "A theft that hasn't occurred. That's an interesting way to put it." "Hypothetical," I said. "The idea is to stay ahead of embarrassment." Lorna held still, letting me carry the script. That told me she knew Wolfe's tactic. Let the director show her hand. "I see." Croft settled back in her chair, folding her hands neatly on the desk. "And what is it exactly you need from me, Mr. Goodwin?" "Procedures," I said. "If, hypothetically, an object from the Institute were loaned temporarily to a private collector, what would the safeguards be? What forms? What insurance? And, separately, I'd like a list of donors with pledged objects, insured and not insured. Twice, if possible. Once to see if it can be compiled, and once again after you tell me it can't." Her lips twitched, and not from amusement. "That's a curious request." "It's a curious case," I said. "We like to match styles." The director turned her attention to Lorna. "You've asked for this?" "Yes," Lorna said simply. The director leaned back, studying her. It was the kind of stare that belongs in a courtroom when the witness forgets which side called her. "Lorna, I trust your dedication. But do you realize what you're suggesting? If word of this investigation leaked, it could jeopardize our negotiations with the Branford Foundation. They're already nervous about lending us their stained glass collection." "That's why it's private," I said. "No leak, no jeopardy." Croft let that sit, her hands now drumming lightly on the desk. "Donors," she said slowly. "Insurance, loans. You're fishing." "Of course," I told her. "But fishing implies we've got bait. All I've got are questions, and you can choose whether to answer." The director studied me, then Lorna, then her desk. She reached for a pen and tapped it against a blotter. "I'll provide the procedure documents. They're public record, though rarely requested. As for donors, some of that information is confidential. I'll need to consult with our board before I hand over names or figures." "Reasonable," I said, though Wolfe would label it evasive. "Still, I'll be back to ask again." Croft's eyes narrowed. "Is Mr. Wolfe planning to make this public?" I gave her my most pleasant smile. "Mr. Wolfe doesn't plan. He concludes. The rest is commentary." That brought me a silence filled with tension thick enough to spread on toast. Croft dismissed us with courtesy polished like her marble floors, but her nostrils, the very ones Wolfe had advised me to watch, flared once when she thought I wasn't looking. Wolfe would call that an answer more eloquent than words. Outside the office, Lorna walked quickly, her heels striking the marble with nervous punctuation. "That could have gone worse," she said under her breath. "True," I admitted. "She didn't throw us out, call security, or faint, but her nostrils made the speech Wolfe was waiting for." She looked at me sharply. "So you think?" "I don't think. Wolfe thinks. I record and deliver. But if you want my amateur hour opinion, your director knows more about missing glass than she'd like her board to suspect." We moved on to the East Gallery. Lorna had promised Wolfe photos by 3 o'clock, but I wanted first-hand impressions. The gallery was cool, dimly lit, and solemn as a chapel. The bay window installation dominated the far wall, a grand half-moon of dark iron and weathered panes, framed by explanatory panels about urban reform. I stood in front of it, hands in pockets, and tried to see what Wolfe would have seen. Lines, light, floors. There. Lorna pointed discreetly at one pane low on the right. "That's the replacement. It rolls light differently. If you move a few inches, you'll see how the refraction shifts faster." I obliged, stepping sideways. She was right. The pane had a sharper, less mellow gleam, like a spotlight among lanterns. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd never see it. But if you did, you couldn't unsee it. "Convincing work," I said. Somebody wanted to prove they could fool you, her lips pressed thin, or wanted to make sure I'd notice. A guard ambled past, giving us the professional half-glance reserved for visitors who were allowed to be there but might not be. I made a note of him, tall, late 40s, with a face like he'd lost too many bets. That would be Denny Jabarian, the security chief she'd mentioned. He gave Lorna a curt nod and kept moving. "You get along with him?" I asked. "Professional," she said. "But he doesn't like interference." I nodded. "Good. I'll interfere." By the time we left the Institute, I had my impressions packed neatly for Wolfe. Lorna looked as though she'd swallowed something that wouldn't settle, but she managed polite thanks and went her way. I caught a cab back to the brownstone, rehearsing how I'd frame the details. Wolfe doesn't like embroidery. He likes cloth cut square. When I arrived, Wolfe was exactly where I'd left him, in his chair, with a glass of beer positioned like punctuation on his desk. He raised his eyebrows the way a banker raises interest. I delivered the report. Croft's careful words, her flaring nostrils, the evasions about donors, and the visual detail of the replaced pane. Wolfe listened without interruption, fingers steepled, eyelids drooping but not closed. When I finished, he grunted, which in Wolfe's language can mean anywhere from pass the salt to proceed with caution. "She evaded," he said finally. "Like a professional fencer," I agreed. "The pane was replaced to be discovered, not concealed. Which means the thief wanted Miss Vale rattled." "Or complicit," Wolfe murmured. He closed his eyes, his lips curving faintly. "Archie, prepare a transcript of your exchange with Director Croft. Then telephone Saul. He must begin with the donors, particularly those who loan items without insurance. There, I think, lies our body behind glass." I started for the typewriter, already knowing the rhythm of the next 24 hours. Saul prowling donors' ledgers, me juggling interviews, and Wolfe tightening strings like a spider who never left his web. Somewhere in the cracks of glass and ambition, someone was hiding a truth sharp enough to cut. And Wolfe, as usual, was ready to make them bleed words before anyone else bled anything worse. Saul Panzer reported in that evening with his usual lack of ceremony. I found him in the office, standing before Wolfe's desk like a man who could have been invisible if he'd wanted to, but didn't bother. He's the kind of guy you'd never notice in a crowd until he asked you for the time, and then you'd hand him your watch and your wallet without realizing you'd done it. Wolfe doesn't waste words on Saul. He doesn't need to. They share a brand of silence that makes me feel like the odd man in the room. "I check donors," Saul said, "especially the ones who loan items uninsured. Found a pattern." He placed a folded sheet on Wolfe's blotter and stepped back, like a cat laying down a mouse. 3 donors with large holdings currently uninsured. One of them, the Branford Foundation, Croft was already nervous about. Another, a man named Myron Eads, deals in architectural salvage, plenty of glasswork. And the third, Caroline Vickers, wealthy widow, eccentric habits, no insurance, plenty of promises. Wolfe grunted softly, eyes still half closed. "Plausible. Which appears most vulnerable?" "Eads," Saul said. "He's had run-ins with the Institute before, argued over attribution of a stained glass transom. He accused them of mislabeling his donation, then withdrew another loan in protest. He's temperamental, has money, and he knows his glass." "That," Wolfe said, "is promising." I piped in. So Eads could have had both motive and skill to swap the pane, leave the note, and rattle Miss Vale. Except, why aim it at her instead of Croft? "Because," Wolfe murmured, "Miss Vale is credible. To discredit her is to paralyze the Institute from within. Croft, however, has defenses, political and financial. Vale has none but her reputation." I glanced at Saul, who gave me the ghost of a nod. "All right," I said. So the man hides a body in glass to destroy her confidence, or he wants her to look guilty. Either way, it's not just petty sabotage. Pfui, Wolfe said, dismissing my flair for the dramatic. The message, it hid the body, is an illusion. Either a literal body concealed behind glass, or a figurative one, a metaphor for concealed guilt. Miss Vale's own apartment was trespassed. That indicates she is the focus, not the Institute alone. Saul, you will probe Mr. Eads. Do not reveal our involvement. Learn whether he has acquired fragments consistent with the missing pane. Saul accepted the assignment like a man agreeing to pick up milk. I'll start tonight, he said. Then he was gone, as silently as he'd come. Wolfe signaled with his finger, and I brought him a fresh beer. He took a long drink, then closed his eyes. Archie, tomorrow you will return to the Institute. Speak with Dr. Whitaker and Peter Blanche. Use Miss Vale as entrée. I want contradictions. Test their nerves. Any particular bait? Yes. Inform them that Miss Vale has engaged me in a private consultation regarding authenticity of the tenement window. Note their reactions. Observe especially if one of them betrays anxiety, not about the substitution itself, but about its discovery. I made the note. Wolfe doesn't like repeating himself, and he doesn't have to. The next morning I escorted Miss Vale back to the Institute with her expression set like a soldier reporting for duty. She had the kind of resolve that suggested she'd rehearsed again, but this time with fewer illusions about control. Dr. Whitaker, the curator, had the bland look of a man who lived among catalogues and expected the world to file itself alphabetically. He was tall, thin, with a chin that seemed determined to poke ahead of him even when the rest of him wanted to stay home. When Lorna introduced me, he nodded like a schoolteacher acknowledging a janitor. I understand you've brought in outside consultation, he said, his tone an indictment. Yes, Lorna replied evenly. A matter of authenticity. Mr. Wolfe has agreed to assist. Whitaker's face twitched. His eyes darted toward the gallery, then back. Authenticity of what, precisely? The bay window, I said smoothly. Miss Vale is thorough. She wanted an independent eye on the piece. He gave me a stare that could have iced a pond. That's unnecessary. I've personally overseen its cataloguing. Every pane was authenticated, every lead joint verified. Except one, I said casually. His chin retreated for the briefest second before jutting forward again. You're misinformed. Possibly, I allowed. That's why Wolfe prefers first-hand confirmation. We'll see where the error lies. Whitaker's lips compressed into a line so thin it might have been cut with a scalpel. He excused himself soon after, but I'd seen the flash in his eyes. Something between indignation and fear. Wolfe would savor that like a garnish. Next on the menu was Peter Blanche, the exhibitions manager. He was young, wiry, with restless hands that fidgeted with a pencil while we talked. He greeted Lorna with the warmth of a colleague who knew she outranked him but wasn't sure by how much. When I brought up Wolfe's name and the word authenticity, his grip on the pencil snapped it clean in two. Sorry, he muttered, tossing the halves aside. I suppose an outside expert can help if it reassures the director. It's not for the director, Lorna said. It's for me. Blanche nodded quickly. Too quickly. Of course. You've always had a sharper eye than most. If something seems off, then it is off. His words tumbled out like they were running from pursuit. I asked him about the installation process, how long it took, who handled the panes. He answered readily, maybe too readily. Details about the scaffolding, the tools, the nights spent arranging glass until dawn. He painted himself as indispensable. But when I pressed about whether he'd ever worked with glazing compound, his throat tightened and he coughed as though dust had suddenly invaded his lungs. We wrapped up with polite nods, But as I left, I had the impression Peter Blanche was a man carrying more weight than his frame could bear. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened while I relayed the 2 interviews. He asked questions sparingly, each one pinning down a detail like a beetle on cork. When I finished, he leaned back, eyes closed. "Whitaker resents intrusion," he said. "Blanche fears discovery. The distinction is critical. Whitaker is defending his authority. Blanche is concealing his guilt. You're sure?" "As sure as I am that Fritz overcooked the lamb last night," Wolfe said. "The guilty man avoids contradiction. The defensive man welcomes it, if only to argue. Blanche's eagerness, his excessive detail, and his sudden discomfort with glazing compound. These betray knowledge he should not possess. I considered that. So Blanche swapped the pain. But why? And why target Miss Vale? That, Wolfe said, remains the crux. Perhaps he acts on behalf of another. Perhaps he seeks to unseat her by proving her incompetent. Perhaps there is indeed a body behind glass, though whether of flesh or reputation we shall learn. The phone rang, interrupting the theory. I answered. It was Saul. "I've got Eads," he said. "He's been shopping around for old window glass, specifically from tenement demolitions, and he's been asking questions about the Institute's holdings. Says he has a piece that matches one in their exhibit." That was enough to make even Wolfe open his eyes. He gestured for the receiver. I handed it over. "Mr. Panzer," Wolfe said, "do not confront him. Do not alert him. Simply acquire, if possible, proof of what he possesses. A photograph, a description from a reliable mouth. That will suffice. And Saul, do not let him suspect he is of interest to us." He hung up, then steepled his fingers. "Archie, tomorrow, assemble all suspects at the brownstone. Miss Vale will assist with the invitations. We must begin to stir the pot more vigorously. If there is truly a body hidden in this affair, it is time we coax it to the surface." I nodded, making the note. Wolfe's office had seen its share of pressure cookers, but I could already tell this one was going to boil over fast. And if glass was meant to hide a body, Wolfe would make sure it became the window through which truth stepped, clear and merciless. The next morning began like most mornings in the brownstone. Wolfe with his orchids, Fritz muttering in German over a sauce that would have put an army to sleep happy, and me at my desk flipping through the day's mail. Except this time, instead of bills, circulars, and invitations to lectures, Wolfe would sooner be embalmed than attend. I had a list of names to corral for the afternoon's performance. Wolfe had decided in his infinite confidence that it was time to bring the suspects into his arena. When Wolfe calls a gathering, it's never social. It's tactical, like moving chess pieces until only one has room to breathe. Miss Vale arrived promptly at 10, looking as though she'd had about 3 hours of sleep and every one of them haunted. She had a folder under her arm and determination written across her face in capital letters. "I've made the calls," she said. "They all agreed to come, though none were enthusiastic." "That's the charm of Wolfe," I told her. "He doesn't need enthusiasm. He collects attendance. He'll pry the rest out with words sharp enough to draw blood." Her gaze flicked toward the office door, behind which Wolfe was still upstairs indulging his morning ritual. "Will he?" "He'll do what he always does," I said. "Sit in that chair and make everyone else sweat." The suspects trickled in by 4. Dr. Whitaker was first, his jaw set as though every step into our office was a march against his pride. Peter Blanche followed, his hands restless even when empty, and I noticed he wouldn't meet Vale's eyes. Felicia Crane, the donor liaison, swept in like she was late to a gala but intended to own it anyway, her perfume arriving a second ahead of her. Denny Jabarian, the security chief, brought up the rear, his expression one long sigh of professional irritation. Director Croft herself was last, punctual to the second, composed as a banker. She gave Wolfe a respectful nod that contained just enough disdain to let us know she was still in charge of her own domain. When Wolfe finally descended and entered the office, silence settled over the room like a heavy quilt. He filled his chair, glanced around the circle, and let his eyes rest half a beat longer on each face than comfort allowed. He didn't have to say a word. They already felt arranged, categorized, and judged. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rich and slow, "you are here because an object of cultural and historic significance has been tampered with. One of you, or one acting for you, has replaced an original pane of glass with a counterfeit and left a shard accompanied by a message. It hid the body." The phrase hung in the air, heavy as lead. Blanche shifted. Felicia raised an eyebrow. Whitaker's jaw twitched. Croft's nostrils flared. Wolfe saw it all, even with his eyes half closed. "I do not summon people lightly," Wolfe continued. "You are here because Miss Vale entrusted me to determine whether this act was a prank, sabotage, or something more serious. I will determine which." He gestured at me, and I took my cue. I read off the details. The shard delivered to Vale's stoop, the residue of glazing compound, the trespass in her apartment. I watched them as I spoke. Whitaker's lips tightened at residue. Blanche rubbed his thumb across his knuckles until they reddened. Felicia looked amused, like she'd just been served a cocktail before the show. Jabarian frowned, all business, but his eyes slid toward Vale more often than toward Wolfe. Croft kept perfectly still, which in my book was its own tell. Wolfe let silence stretch after I finished. He has a way of making silence work harder than most men make words. Finally, he said, "Miss Crane, you liaise with donors. Why should a donor wish to undermine Miss Vale?" Felicia gave a light laugh, the kind meant to disarm. "Oh, Mr. Wolfe, donors undermine staff every day. It's called negotiation, but Lorna isn't exactly their enemy. She's, how shall I put it, indispensable. Without her, the Institute's reputation for preservation would be far weaker, and donors like strong reputations when their names are attached." "Pooh," Wolfe said. "Flattery and equivocation, both are useless." Her smile faltered for just a second, and I caught it. Wolfe had drawn first blood. He turned his gaze on Whitaker. "Doctor, you pride yourself on cataloguing authenticity. Yet a substitution was made under your authority. How do you explain this oversight?" Whitaker's chin jutted. "I explain it as impossible. If a substitution occurred, it was without my knowledge. I can only conclude Miss Vale misinterpreted what she saw." That earned him a sharp intake of breath from Vale, but Wolfe raised a hand and she held her tongue. "So you assert that the glass is genuine?" "I do." "Then you contradict Miss Vale, who has demonstrated expertise in such matters." Whitaker's nostrils flared. "Her expertise is not infallible." Wolfe allowed himself a small smile. "Indeed, neither is yours. Yet it is convenient, Doctor, that you prefer to deny rather than to investigate." The room shifted uncomfortably, and Wolfe turned his attention to Blanche. "Mr. Blanche, you assisted in the installation. Describe your familiarity with glazing compound." Blanche's throat worked. "Minimal. I supervised. I didn't handle the materials directly. Yet you recited the process in detail to Mr. Goodwin yesterday. A memory so clear it betrayed practice. How do you reconcile the difference?" Blanche stammered. I may have overstated. I was nervous." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "You are still nervous." By now, sweat was dotting Blanche's temple. He looked cornered, though Wolfe hadn't even raised his voice. "Mr. Jabarian," Wolfe said, swiveling his gaze, "you guard what others treasure. Yet someone entered Miss Vale's apartment uninvited. How do you account for that?" The security chief scowled. "I'm not her personal bodyguard. I secure the Institute. Apartments are police business. But you know, do you not, the methods by which staff access private spaces? Miss Vale is not your subordinate, but she is under the Institute's roof. If her apartment was trespassed, the culprit had confidence. Such confidence often stems from knowledge of weak points. That falls within your purview. Jabarian's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Wolfe let the silence do the rest. Finally, Wolfe turned his attention to Croft. Director, you were reluctant to share donor information. Why? Her eyes met his directly. Because it is confidential, and because rumors of theft or substitution could cost us millions in pledged gifts. My duty is to protect the Institute. Even at the cost of Miss Vale's reputation? If necessary. That hung heavier than the rest. Vale's hands clasped tightly in her lap, but she didn't speak. Croft's composure didn't waver. Wolfe inhaled deeply and reached for his beer. He took a long drink, set it down, and said, "One of you has tampered with history, not merely an object. You have also tampered with a woman's life, her privacy, and her dignity. You imagine yourselves clever. You are not. The glass will not conceal you. It will reveal." He rang the bell cord, and Fritz entered. Discreet as ever, Wolfe instructed him to bring refreshments. He always feeds his suspects. It makes them linger longer and squirm more. As the trays arrived, conversation broke out in guarded tones. Blanche whispered something to Felicia that she dismissed with a flick of her hand. Whitaker hovered near Croft, as though hoping her authority could shield him. Jabarian stood alone, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like a man measuring threats. Vale stayed near me, tense but grateful not to be the center of Wolfe's attention. When the suspects finally departed, Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes. "Archie, you will shadow Mr. Blanche tomorrow. He is sweating too soon. A guilty man reveals himself not by denial, but by fear of being questioned again. Saul will continue with Eads. Between them, we will find who thought a pane of glass could hide a body." "All right," I said. "And if it really did?" "Then," Wolfe said softly, "we shall uncover not only a fraud, but a corpse. Both demand exposure." And just like that, he shut his eyes and reached for his beer. The room still held the echoes of tension, but for Wolfe, the pieces were already shifting into place. For me, it meant tomorrow would involve following a nervous exhibition manager who sweated under questions like a pain under a hammer. And sooner or later, one of those cracks was going to spread. The next day started with me planting myself in a borrowed sedan across the street from the Glasstown Institute, a hot cup of bad coffee balanced on the dashboard, and my eyes fixed on Peter Blanche. Wolfe had ordered me to shadow him, and Blanche was obliging by looking like a man rehearsing guilt in public. He came out a little after 9, twitchy in his coat, head turning as if pigeons might be following him. He set off briskly down the avenue, and I eased into gear to keep him company from a discreet distance. He didn't head straight to work. Instead, he made a detour into a hardware store. Through the window, I saw him pick up a tube of glazing compound and a putty knife. I admit my pulse jumped. It was too neat a coincidence. He paid cash, shoved the items into a paper bag, and left without looking back. Either the man was preparing to fix a window at home, or he was the dumbest guilty party I'd ever tailed. Blanche's next stop was less practical. A small cafe with mismatched chairs and an atmosphere thick with stale espresso. He sat at a corner table, drumming his fingers while pretending to read a newspaper. 10 minutes later, a woman joined him. Not Felicia Crane, not Miss Vale, but someone new. Younger, dressed like she'd rather be in a gallery opening than a coffee shop. They spoke in low tones, leaning close. I couldn't hear, but I didn't need sound to read agitation. Blanche gestured with the hand that wasn't clenching his cup, and she shook her head, sharp, final. She left first, leaving him staring at the table like it had betrayed him. I let him stew for a few minutes before he moved on, bag still in hand. His next destination was a side street lined with brownstones not unlike Wolfe's, though without the sense of permanence ours radiates. He ducked into one, glancing over his shoulder as he did. That was enough for me. I parked, strolled up the opposite sidewalk, and clocked the number. Apartment building. Not his own, judging from the mailbox labels. I loitered until a delivery man went in, then slipped behind him like a man checking mail. Inside, I didn't have to wait long. Blanche reappeared in the hallway, moving toward a door half open on the 3rd floor. He disappeared inside, and the door clicked shut. I waited 5 minutes, long enough to make sure he wasn't just borrowing sugar. Then I went up, quiet as Fritz sneaking a late snack. The door had no peephole and no chain. I pressed my ear to it and caught the unmistakable scrape of wood and the dull thud of glass. He was working on something. Temptation tugged me, but Wolfe hadn't ordered breaking and entering, and I don't freelance felonies. I went back down, out, and returned to the sedan. A half hour later, Blanche emerged again, looking both lighter and more worried, as though he'd left a burden inside but wasn't sure it would stay put. He carried the bag empty now, folded in his hand. I trailed him back toward the Institute, satisfied I had enough to keep Wolfe's brain busy until midnight. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair, eyes closed, lips set in the serene disapproval he reserves for interruptions. I interrupted anyway. I gave him the report in full, the hardware store, the meeting with the mystery woman, the suspicious apartment visit. Wolfe opened his eyes long enough to glare at the words glazing compound, then shut them again. "Archie," he said, "you're certain? Unless the store clerks have begun planting false evidence for fun, yes?" Wolfe drummed his fingers on the armrest. "The meeting with the woman. Describe her." I did my best sketch. Younger, fashionable, uneasy, but firm. Wolfe absorbed the details with his usual economy. "And the apartment?" 3rd floor of a brownstone. He stayed about half an hour. The sounds were glass and wood, no mistaking it. Wolfe exhaled through his nose. "So, Mr. Blanche is practicing. He's either attempting to replicate the substitution or conceal the original. Both are damning." The phone rang before he could elaborate. I answered. It was Saul. "I've got Eads again," Saul said. "He's showing off a pain to a contact of mine. Claims it came from the tenement fire window. Says it proves the Institute's collection isn't what it claims. My man described it. Size and cracks match the shard Miss Vale received." That was enough to stir even Wolfe. He motioned for the receiver, and I passed it over. "Mr. Panzer," Wolfe said, "you will secure the pain. Purchase, if necessary. Discretion paramount. Do not allow Eads to suspect he is the focus. Report when you have it." He hung up without waiting for acknowledgement. He leaned back, eyes shut, fingers steepled. "Archie, we are converging. Blanche rehearses substitution. Eads possesses the original pain. The woman indicates collusion or coercion. The message to Miss Vale was designed to implicate her or shatter her confidence. The glass did not hide a body. It hides a theft, and, possibly, a betrayal more personal. Meaning, Wolfe said, that Miss Vale's enemies are not only institutional, but intimate. The trespass into her apartment was no random act. It was a signal. At that moment, the front bell rang. I went, and there stood Miss Vale, pale but resolute. She had another envelope in her hand. "It was on my doorstep again," she said, voice tight. I took her into the office. Wolfe opened his eyes long enough to wave her to the red leather chair. She handed me the envelope. No handwriting, just the same neat printing as before. Inside was another card, 3 words this time, "Behind her window." Wolfe sat forward, the movement so rare it made the air shift. "Miss Vale," he said, "what window does this refer to?" She swallowed. "My bedroom has a bay window, original glass, I've always loved it. Archie, Wolfe said, his voice clipped. At once. I didn't argue. Within 20 minutes I was in her apartment, with Vale trailing behind me. The place was neat, orderly, with that peculiar quiet of a life lived among fragile things. The bay window stood out, elegant and old, the glass rippling slightly in the light. I examined each pane. At first glance, nothing. But then, near the base, I saw it. A small seam where the putty line was fresher, the glass set just a hair differently. I tapped gently, and the pane sounded dull, not hollow. Something was inside. "Miss Vale," I said quietly. "Step back." Using a pocket knife, I pried carefully at the edge. The pane lifted out more easily than I liked. Behind it, nestled in the cavity between the outer and inner frames, was a folded sheet of paper, browned with age but intact. I pulled it out, spread it open. It was a ledger page, handwritten, listing names and figures. Donations, payoffs. The ink had bled in places, but one word leapt out. Croft. Miss Vale gasped. "That's evidence," I said grimly, "and bait." When I brought it back to the brownstone, Wolfe took one look and let his lips curl in satisfaction. So, the window hid not a body of flesh, but a body of proof. Financial impropriety, concealed for decades, now unearthed to strike at the present. "And someone," I said, "went to a lot of trouble to make sure Miss Vale would be the one to find it." Wolfe closed his eyes, but his voice was sharp. "Then tomorrow, Archie, we will present our guests again. This time, they will see the pain for what it truly concealed, and one of them will break." And I knew with the certainty of a man watching a storm gather that Wolfe was right. Someone was about to crack like glass under pressure. By the time morning settled over the brownstone, Wolfe had already decided the stage was ready for another gathering. I could tell because he ordered Fritz to prepare extra sandwiches, which is Wolfe's way of declaring war without leaving his chair. Saul had called in late the previous night, reporting that he had secured the pain from Eads through a middleman, no questions asked. It was locked in Saul's safe until Wolfe gave the word. With the ledger page from Miss Vale's window already on Wolfe's desk, we had two pieces of evidence, each sharp enough to cut through pretenses. Wolfe meant to use them like scalpels. At noon, sharp, the parade returned. Croft, Whitaker, Blanche, Crane, and Jabarian filed into the office like a reluctant jury, each suspect avoiding the other's eyes. Miss Vale sat stiff in the red chair, a silent witness to her own peril. Wolfe regarded them with a face that could have been carved out of indifference, except for the faint gleam in his eyes when he looked at the sealed envelope that held the ledger. He began without preamble. "Since our last meeting, new developments have occurred. One concerns a pane of glass removed from the Institute. Another concerns a window in Miss Vale's own apartment. Both contain revelations. You will hear them, and then you will account for yourselves." That was enough to make Blanche's fingers twitch, Whitaker's jaw clench, and Croft lean forward in a way that looked casual to anyone but me. "Mr. Goodwin," Wolfe said, "if you would." I placed the ledger page on the desk, unfolded it, and read aloud the damning part. Lists of donations, shadowed by payoffs, and the name Croft, written twice in bold hand, connected to figures that looked a lot like diversions. The silence afterward was thick enough to block sound. Croft broke it first, her voice steady but her cheeks pale. "That page proves nothing. Anyone could have planted it." "Indeed," Wolfe said, "yet it was concealed behind Miss Vale's window for decades. Whoever trespassed her apartment did not place it there, they retrieved it. The note, it hid the body, referred to this body of evidence. It was meant for her to find, because her honesty would compel her to expose it. And the Institute, under your stewardship, Director, would suffer scandal." Croft drew herself up. "You accuse me of theft from my own institution?" "No," Wolfe said dryly. "I accuse you of inheritance. Those figures date to before your tenure. But you feared exposure, and you are not the only one who did." His eyes shifted to Blanche, who was visibly sweating. "Mr. Blanche has been practicing with glazing compound. Yesterday he spent 30 minutes in a private apartment rehearsing the substitution of glass. A guilty man rehearses when he fears discovery. What were you preparing, Mr. Blanche?" Blanche stammered. I just... My landlord asked me..." "Pfui," Wolfe said, the sound like a hammer. "You are not a tradesman. You are an exhibition manager. Your interest in putty knives is not civic duty. It is complicity. Did you assist in hiding the ledger page, or were you hired to retrieve it?" Blanche's lips moved, but words failed him. Felicia Crane stepped into the silence with the smoothness of someone accustomed to patching holes. "Really, Mr. Wolfe, this is melodramatic. Old ledgers, anxious managers, suspicious pains. It could all be coincidence, unless you have something more direct." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Miss Crane, your métier is donors. You calculate value in the currency of favor, yet you too stand implicated. Saul Panzer has procured a pane of glass now in the possession of Myron Eads, a donor. He claims it matches the Eyes Institute's. It was offered to him quietly, to bolster his grievance against you. Who, I wonder, would feed him such a gift? Someone who wished to weaponize his resentment against Miss Vale. Someone with access." Felicia's smile thinned. "You can't mean me. Why would I hand Eads a weapon?" "To shift suspicion," Wolfe replied, "and to force Miss Vale to defend against enemies on all sides. Divide, distract, and weaken. A strategy as old as ambition." The room simmered. Whitaker finally burst. "This is outrageous. You're spinning fantasies from fragments of glass and half-read scribbles." "Fragments," Wolfe said, "suffice when they match." He gestured to me, and I laid the shard from Vale's stoop beside Saul's recovered pane, the cracks lined like veins on a palm. "There," Wolfe said simply. "The original pane, restored. A substitution occurred, not imagined. Mr. Whitaker, your authority failed. Mr. Blanche, your hands are dirty. Miss Crane, your maneuvering is transparent. Director Croft, your fear is understandable but misplaced. And Mr. Jabarian—" The security chief looked up, startled. Wolfe's voice grew colder. "You stood silent while Miss Vale's apartment was entered. No guard is omniscient, but you knew. You knew because your resignation comes not from boredom, but from compromise. You allowed entry, perhaps for payment, perhaps for persuasion, but you cannot deny your part." Jabarian's face hardened, but he said nothing. That silence was worse than denial. Wolfe took a long drink of beer, set the glass down and leaned back. The motive is clear. Decades-old impropriety, concealed behind glass, discovered now and threatening the reputations of the Institute. One of you feared exposure, another seized the chance to profit, another sought to sabotage. You collided in deceit, and Miss Vale became your chosen victim. But the truth, like light through glass, refracts. It cannot be hidden. The suspects looked at one another, each seeing their own reflection in the cracks Wolfe had drawn. Blanche finally broke, his voice cracking with him. "It wasn't me who found the ledger. I was told to—" He bit the words back, but it was too late. Wolfe's eyes glinted. "Told to? Yes. By whom?" Wolfe let the silence sharpen until it cut. Blanche's gaze darted to Croft, then to Crane, then to the floor. "That," Wolfe said softly, "is enough for now. Archie, escort our guests out. We shall digest." As I ushered them, the air bristled with unspoken accusations. Blanche sagged, Crane seethed, Whitaker simmered, Croft held her mask, and Jabarian radiated defiance. Miss Vale walked out pale but upright, like someone balancing on a tightrope. When the door closed behind them, Wolfe let out a breath as though he had consumed too much and was now ready to savor. "We have them, Archie. They are cracking, pane by pane. Tomorrow the fissure will widen. One will confess, not out of conscience, but out of desperation. "Which one?" I asked. Wolfe closed his eyes, lips curling in that infuriatingly serene smile. "The one whose reflection distorts most when the light passes through. We need only wait for the right angle." And so the brownstone settled into its uneasy calm again, but the case had shifted. The broken glass was no longer just evidence of theft. It was a mirror, showing each suspect what they feared to see, and Wolfe, immovable as ever, was already polishing it until the image grew unbearable. That evening the brownstone was quieter than usual, which is saying something for a house where silence is the default setting. Fritz had retreated to the kitchen with the wounded pride of a man whose béarnaise had been ignored in favor of Wolfe's appetite for beer, and Wolfe himself sat in his chair, like a block of marble that had been smuggled in from a museum. He hadn't spoken since the suspects left, which is how I knew he was at his most dangerous. Silence for Wolfe isn't absence. It's digestion, and the meal wasn't food. It was the fractured expressions of 5 people forced to face themselves in his office. I was working through my notes on Blanche's slip, writing it out in triplicate for Wolfe's files, when the phone rang. Wolfe opened his eyes and looked at me like I had invented telecommunication just to disturb him. I answered. It was Saul Panzer. "I've got more on Eads," he said. "He didn't just get the pain. He's been bragging he'll publish a paper proving the Institute has faked half its exhibit. Claims he has the documents to back it up." "Documents?" I asked. "Copies of ledgers, supposedly. Not just the one you found in Vale's window. More, with other names. Could be forgeries, could be real. But he's been baited, and he's too proud not to bite." I thanked Saul, promised Wolfe would call if needed, and hung up. Wolfe had his eyes shut again, but his lips curved in faint amusement. "Of course, Mr. Eads is being fed. The pain, the ledgers, it is too tidy. He is not the architect, only the instrument. Instruments sing the tune they are given." "Which leaves us," I said, trying to figure out who wrote the sheet music. "Precisely. And the hand that fed him did so to wound Miss Vale. She is honest, therefore vulnerable. A liar may survive accusation, but honesty is brittle. Once cracked, it shatters." That was Wolfe at his most poetic, and when he gets poetic, you know the case is closer to the bone than he admits. The next morning brought a visitor uninvited. It was Felicia Crane, arriving before Wolfe had even seen his orchids. Fritz looked scandalized to have to admit her before 10, but she sailed into the office like she owned it. She was dressed sharper than a blade and wore a smile that suggested she had a secret she meant to trade. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, settling into the red chair without waiting for permission. "I came alone. That should tell you something." "It tells me," Wolfe replied, "that you are impatient." She laughed lightly. "No, it tells you I'm practical. I don't like being lumped in with the rest. You want to know who's playing games with glass and ledgers? Look at Blanche. He's out of his depth. If he hasn't confessed already, he will." Wolfe tilted his head, eyelids heavy. "You came to denounce him?" "Why?" "Because I'm tired of being used as cover. The Institute is full of petty rivalries, but this is beyond sabotage. Someone wants Lorna Vale destroyed, and if I'm dragged down with her, I won't forgive it." Her words were smooth, but I'd heard smoother. I asked, "And what's in it for you if we take your tip and hang Blanche?" She turned to me with that bright smile. "Survival, Mr. Goodwin. That's always in style." Wolfe sipped his beer, then set it down with a click. "You are diverting suspicion, but in doing so, you reveal knowledge you ought not to have. You say someone wants Miss Vale destroyed. That is true, but how do you know the intent rather than merely the effect?" Felicia's smile faltered just for a second, but Wolfe saw it. He always does. She leaned back. "Because I've been around long enough to know when ambition turns vicious. You don't need a ledger to see it." "Pfui," Wolfe said softly. "We shall see." She left soon after, all polish again, but I didn't miss the way she avoided my eyes on the way out. Wolfe tugged at his lip once she was gone. "That woman," he muttered, "is too fluent. The guilty talk too much. Yet she is not the hand. She is a veil. Archie, we must break Blanche." That was my cue, and I didn't waste the afternoon. I found Blanche outside the institute, chain-smoking like a man trying to exhale his conscience. I struck up conversation under the guise of casual inquiry. He was twitchy, pale, and when I mentioned the ledger in Vale's window, he almost dropped his cigarette. "You don't understand," he blurted. I was told to get rid of it, to keep it from resurfacing." "By who?" I asked. He shook his head violently. "If I talk, I'm finished." "You're finished already," I told him. "The only question is whether you're finished alone or with someone else for company." He crumbled faster than week-old pastry. "It was Croft. She came to me weeks ago, said there were rumors about an old ledger. She wanted me to make sure if it turned up, it disappeared again. I didn't know it was in Lorna's apartment until she hinted. Then someone else got to it first. She told me to stay quiet, to make repairs if necessary, to keep suspicion off the institute. But I swear I didn't write those notes. I didn't leave that shard. I didn't." I took it all in, filed it neat, and walked away before he could start rehearsing denials. By the time I got back to the Brown Stone, Wolfe was waiting, hungry not for lunch, but for answers. I gave him the confession, word for word. He listened, eyes closed, hands steepled. When I finished, he exhaled. So, Croft sought to conceal impropriety. Blanche became her instrument, Eads her decoy, Crane her veil, Whitaker her apologist, Jabarian her accomplice. A symphony of self-interest, all conducted to sacrifice Miss Vale. "And the notes left at her stoop?" I asked. "Those," Wolfe said, opening his eyes, "were not Croft's work. Too theatrical, too personal. Someone else sought not just to silence her, but to terrify her. That hand remains hidden. We will find it tomorrow. They will all return here, and this time the glass will break entirely." He rang for Fritz, ordered beer, and closed his eyes again. I knew better than to push further. When Wolfe says tomorrow, he means the trap is set and all I have to do is bait it. But I couldn't shake the image of those stark words. It hid the body behind her window, and wonder whose hand had pressed them onto cardstock, neat and merciless. One thing was certain. The next gathering at the Brownstone wouldn't end with sandwiches and polite exits. Someone was going to shatter, and Wolfe would be there to watch the pieces fall. By the time the suspects returned to the Brownstone the following afternoon, Wolfe had arranged his office like a courtroom. The red chair was positioned for Miss Vale again, the others set in a semicircle that forced them to face Wolfe as if the room itself had sworn them in. Fritz had prepared sandwiches, but they were props. The real nourishment Wolfe intended was confession. I could feel it in the way he sat, upright in his chair, his eyes half closed but more awake than anyone else in the room. The guests filed in with varying degrees of reluctance. Blanche looked as if he'd aged 10 years overnight, his hands restless. Croft's expression was marble, her suit sharper than yesterday, as if armor could substitute for innocence. Whitaker carried his pride like a banner, still offended that Wolfe questioned his authority. Felicia Crane glided in smooth as glass, but her eyes darted quickly, betraying nerves. Jabarian lingered near the door, arms crossed, a man who wanted to be anywhere else. Miss Vale sat quietly, though the tightness in her jaw told me she was bracing for impact. Wolfe let the silence hold until it grew unbearable. Then he spoke, voice even but heavy as stone. "We have established that a pane of glass was substituted, that a shard was delivered with a message, and that Miss Vale's apartment was trespassed to reveal a ledger implicating names from the Institute's past. Mr. Eads has been furnished with fragments and copies to inflame his grievance. All of you, in different degrees, are implicated. But today, we move beyond fragments. Today, we reach the hand that wrote the message. I brought out the 2 cards, laid them on Wolfe's desk. The neat block letters stared back at the suspects. It hid the body. Behind her window. Wolfe regarded them as though they were insects pinned for study. The phrasing, he continued, is deliberate, not the language of theft, but of menace. It is personal. Croft wished concealment, Blanche feared exposure, Crane maneuvered, Whitaker denied, Jabarian permitted. But none of them left these. They are not corporate acts, they are intimate. He let his gaze travel slowly around the circle. Someone here knows Miss Vale closely enough to know her apartment, her window, her vulnerabilities. Someone who sought not merely to distract or protect, but to terrify. That, ladies and gentlemen, narrows the field. Felicia's smile faltered. Are you suggesting? Pfui, Wolfe cut her off. You intercede with donors. You manipulate, yes, but you do not menace in riddles. Director Croft, your crime is omission, concealment. You fear exposure, but threats are beneath you. Mr. Whitaker, you are arrogant, but arrogance does not creep into a woman's home. Mr. Blanche, you are guilty of cowardice, but not of poetry. That leaves one. His eyes opened fully and fixed on Jabarian. The security chief shifted, his arms tightening across his chest. You, Wolfe said softly, had the keys. You had the access. You had the resignation of a man who has already compromised himself. And you had the knowledge of her window because you inspected it. Did you not, Mr. Jabarian, under pretext of ensuring its integrity? You saw the cavity where the ledger lay, and you understood what terror it would bring if she were forced to discover it. You, therefore, wrote the messages. The room froze. Jabarian's lips pressed thin, but he said nothing. Wolfe's voice grew sharper. You were paid, no doubt, to permit access. Perhaps by Croft, perhaps by Crane, but you exceeded your brief. You sought to enjoy it. You made yourself author. Admit it. Jabarian's jaw worked. Then, in a low voice, he said, You think you know everything? You don't. I did find the ledger. I saw what it meant. Croft wasn't the only name. There were others who'd rather see Vale ruined than have those records surface. I left the notes because I wanted her to back off, to keep away from it. If she'd been smart, she would have walked away. Miss Vale's voice rang out, tight but strong. So you wanted to frighten me into silence? He didn't meet her eyes. Better silence than destroyed. Wolfe leaned back, eyes half closing again. You rationalize. You do not protect. You threaten. You trespassed. You manipulated. And in doing so, you expose the Institute more than any ledger could. Your vanity undid you. Croft finally broke her marble silence. This is madness. If this gets out, the Institute will survive, Wolfe said. Institutions are sturdier than reputations. Miss Vale will survive too because she has entrusted herself to me. You, Director, will negotiate your board. Mr. Whitaker will continue to catalogue. Miss Crane will continue to flatter donors. Mr. Blanche will return to his tools with diminished authority. Mr. Jabarian. He opened his eyes and fixed the man with a gaze colder than glass. Will answer to the police. That was the end of it. No one moved until I escorted them out, one by one, each leaving in silence heavier than accusation. Jabarian went last. His shoulders slumped, but his eyes still hard, as though daring the law to prove Wolfe right. When the door closed behind them, Miss Vale turned to Wolfe. You've saved me, she said quietly. Wolfe shook his head. No, madam. I've preserved the truth. You will save yourself if you remain steadfast. She nodded, her composure returning. Then I will. After she left, Wolfe sighed and reached for his beer. Archie, he murmured. The case is closed. A pane of glass hid a ledger. A man hid behind intimidation, and fools believed concealment would last forever. But nothing is so fragile as glass, nor so revealing when broken. I leaned back, My notes finished, my curiosity still burning. And Miss Vale? She, Wolfe said, lifting the glass, is unbroken. That is the only result worth the trouble. And with that, he drank, shutting his eyes, the brown stone settling once more into its sacred calm, as if nothing had ever disturbed it but the memory of glass that hid a body of truth. The following morning should have been routine again. Orchids upstairs, Fritz experimenting with sauces downstairs, Wolfe contemplating the virtues of indolence in his chair. But the air inside the brownstone still carried the static left behind by the last gathering. When Wolfe names a culprit, that's usually the end of the parade, but this case hadn't settled yet. Wolfe's silences are many things, but never empty, and the way he'd closed his eyes after condemning Jabarian had felt more like a pause than a period. I was working at my desk when the phone rang. Wolfe barely moved, so I answered. It was Saul. His voice was low, urgent. "Archie, something new. Eads is furious. Someone broke into his warehouse last night. The pain I secured from him, gone." I stiffened. "Gone? I thought you had it locked away." I did. This was another. He had more than one piece, or so he claimed. Said he was going to compare them against the Institute's photos. Now they're missing. He thinks the Institute sent men to silence him. I thanked Saul and hung up. Wolfe opened one eye at me. "Report," I told him. His brows lowered, his face clouding with the particular distaste he reserves for clumsy moves. "So," he said, "the matter is not finished. Someone still fears exposure. Jabarian's intimidation was indeed personal, but he was not the hand that orchestrated the theft or fed Eads. That hand still moves." "Then you fingered the wrong man yesterday?" I asked. "Pfui. Jabarian trespassed and wrote the notes. He is guilty. But guilt, Archie, is not exclusive. It breeds in colonies. One may be guilty of menace, another of theft, a third of manipulation. To resolve the whole requires more." That was Wolfe's way of admitting we weren't done. He tugged at his lip, then issued orders. "Archie, summon Miss Vale again, also Director Croft, this time privately. No gallery of suspects. I wish their answers without the insulation of others' presence." I made the calls. Croft agreed stiffly, Vale with obvious relief. They arrived separately that afternoon, Vale first. She looked steadier, though shadows lingered under her eyes. Croft arrived on time to the minute, her expression controlled, her suit immaculate. Wolfe wasted no time. "Director Croft," he said, "the ledger concealed behind Miss Vale's window contained your name among others. Yesterday, you dismissed it as planted. That was defensive. Today, I ask plainly, do you know of financial irregularities in the Institute's past?" Croft's nostrils flared, a tell I'd already memorized. But her voice stayed calm. "Yes, the Institute has had creative accounting in its history. Donors expect favors, naming rights, influence. Records were adjusted to please them. It was not my doing, but I inherited the consequences." "And you feared exposure?" "Of course. Scandal can cripple funding, but I did not arrange substitutions or send notes. My goal was containment, not theater." Wolfe's eyes closed, as if weighing the timbre of her words. "Miss Vale, you're hearing this. Does it surprise you?" She hesitated. "No, I suspected. The Institute thrives too well on too few gifts." Croft turned sharply to her. "And yet you came to Wolfe. Do you realize the damage?" "I realize," Vale said steadily, "that someone invaded my home. That is not damage. It is violation." Wolfe lifted a finger and they both fell silent. "Director, who else besides you knew of those ledgers?" Croft's lips pressed thin. "Felicia Crane. She manages donors. She has seen enough to piece together their weight. And Whitaker, he may have guessed, but it was Felicia who once warned me certain records were dangerous." That was interesting. I wrote it down while Wolfe sat motionless. At last he said, Very well. You may go. Both of you. They left, Vale glancing back with the quiet gratitude of someone clinging to a lifeline, Croft walking out stiff and straight. When the door shut, Wolfe opened his eyes fully. Archie, it is Miss Crane. She is the fulcrum. She knew the ledgers. She liaises with donors. She manipulates reputations. She fed Eads the pain, stoked his grievance, and arranged the theft from his warehouse. Jabarian wrote the notes, yes, but at her suggestion. He supplied the access. She supplied the intent. Croft concealed. Blanche obeyed. Whitaker denied. But Felicia Crane maneuvered. She is the hand behind the glass. I whistled low. Then tomorrow, Wolfe said, we summon only her, alone. The trap must close cleanly. The next morning, Felicia arrived all smiles, as if she expected to charm her way through. Wolfe greeted her with courtesy so formal it chilled the air. He gestured to the red chair. She sat, legs crossed, perfume trailing. Miss Crane, Wolfe began, you spoke eloquently of survival. Indeed, you have survived, by calculation, but you overreached. You gave Eads the pain. You dangled ledgers. You told Jabarian where to place the notes, what to write. You sought to destroy Miss Vale, not with evidence alone, but with fear. Admit it. Her smile didn't waver, but her fingers tightened on her knee. That's a dramatic story. Do you have proof? Yes, Wolfe said calmly. Eads described the messenger who delivered the pain. A woman, stylish, poised, whose description matches you precisely. Saul Panzer has confirmed it. Your vanity betrayed you. Her eyes flashed, the smile finally gone. That old fool. He would sell his mother's dentures for attention. Perhaps, Wolfe said, but he described you too accurately. And more, Jabarian confessed. He said he was told what to do, what to write. He named you. She stood abruptly, but Wolfe's voice held her still. Sit. Survival, you said. Survival requires sacrifice. You sacrificed Miss Vale to shield the Institute, and yourself most of all. But survival now requires another choice. You may confess to the police voluntarily, with Croft's board to protect your position, or you may deny and watch the Institute collapse under scandal. Which shall it be? For a long moment she said nothing. Then she sat again, shoulders sagging, voice low. I never meant to ruin her. I only needed her frightened enough to stay silent. Croft couldn't afford the ledgers, and neither could I. So yes, I arranged it. I gave Eads the pain. I told Jabarian what to do. I thought... She stopped, breath shaking. I thought it would end there. Wolfe's lips curled, not in triumph, but in weary disdain. So many crimes are born from the thought that they will end quickly. They never do. I called Inspector Kramer, and he arrived with the familiar scowl of a man who both hated and needed Wolfe. Felicia was taken quietly, her composure cracking at last. When the house was calm again, Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes, and said, Archie, note this. Glass hides nothing. It refracts. Those who imagine concealment behind transparency are fools. Noted, I said. And Miss Vale? She will rebuild, Wolfe murmured. She has integrity. Unlike glass, it does not crack when struck. It endures. Dinner that night was lamb done to Wolfe's satisfaction, and for once he offered Fritz a rare compliment. The brown stone exhaled back into its sacred order. But I couldn't help thinking of Felicia Crane's last words, trembling as she confessed. She thought it would end there. They always do, until Wolfe sits in his chair and shows them it never does. The next day dawned with the kind of crisp brightness that makes New York look almost honest, though Wolfe wouldn't have noticed if the sky had rained emeralds. He stayed in his chair, heavy-lidded and immovable, while I went through the motions of answering the phone, sorting mail, and keeping the world at bay. But the case hadn't finished breathing, It lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Felicia Crane was behind bars, yes, but Wolfe hadn't delivered the summation that wrapped the strands into a single rope, and until he did, I knew better than to expect peace. It was Miss Vale who returned first, unannounced but not unwelcome. She stepped into the office with a hesitance that didn't disguise the relief on her face. She looked lighter, as if a burden had finally slid off her shoulders. Wolfe raised his eyes to her and inclined his head slightly, the closest thing he offers to a welcome. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "I owe you more than thanks. Felicia's arrest has already reached the Institute. Croft has convened the board to address irregularities. Whitaker avoids me in the halls, and Blanche has offered apologies so profuse I almost believe him. The storm has broken, but I came because I needed to hear it from you. Why me? Why was I the target?" Wolfe drew in a long breath, then released it with a faint grunt. "Because, madam, you are incorruptible. That is both your armor and your vulnerability. In an institution compromised by self-interest, an incorruptible conservator is dangerous. You would not deny what you found, nor bury it. They feared your honesty more than any thief, and so you became the sacrifice." Her eyes softened, though her jaw tightened. "And Felicia thought intimidation would silence me." "She mistook honesty for fragility," Wolfe said. "An error common to those who believe all others are as venal as themselves. She wished not only to bury the ledger, but to bury you beneath suspicion and fear. A pane of glass became her metaphor. Foolish, but effective enough to rattle you." I added, "And Croft wasn't innocent either. She didn't write notes or slip into your apartment, but she used Blanche and Jabarian to keep the lid on. She'd have let Felicia do the dirty work if it meant the board stayed blind." Miss Vale nodded slowly. "So I was caught between their fear and her ambition." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "Glass is transparent, but those who believe they can hide behind it mistake clarity for concealment. It is always the honest eye that reveals what lies beneath." She smiled faintly, the first unshadowed smile I'd seen from her. "Then I'm grateful my honesty led me here." Wolfe inclined his head again, then closed his eyes, signaling the audience was at an end. She rose, thanked him once more, and left. The silence that followed was almost companionable. It lasted until Inspector Kramer arrived, stomping in with his hat clutched like a weapon and the smell of a cigar trailing behind him. He didn't bother with preliminaries. "Wolfe, you've handed me Crane on a platter, and I'll give you that. She's talking, and it lines up, but I'll be damned if I like being used as your errand boy. You could have called me sooner, saved me a week of paperwork." Wolfe opened his eyes long enough to deliver a dry stare. "You would not have listened sooner. You rarely do." Kramer growled, but he didn't argue. "Vale's in the clear. The board's already scrambling to put the Institute's books in order, and Eads is yelling fraud from the rooftops. We'll mop up the rest, but you'd better hope none of this lands on my desk as unfinished." "Inspector," Wolfe said, "the case is concluded. You may tidy the debris. That is your métier. Mine is clarity." Kramer grunted something impolite and left, the door rattling behind him. I watched Wolfe settle back again, already retreating into his world of orchids and beer. That evening, over a dinner Fritz produced with the pride of a man cooking for victory, veal cutlets with a sauce. Even Wolfe praised, "We finally reached the true ending." Wolfe had finished his second helping and was sipping beer when he spoke. Not to me, not even to Fritz, but to the room itself. "Glass is peculiar," he said. "It promises to show us the world clearly, yet it bends and distorts. Men believe they can hide behind it because they forget it is fragile. A ledger, a pain, a reputation, none can remain concealed forever. Break the glass, and all is revealed." I couldn't resist. "So the moral is, never trust windows." He gave me a glance sharp enough to cut. "The moral, Archie, is that concealment is never security. Only integrity endures. Miss Vale understands that. Her enemies did not. I leaned back, satisfied. And you, naturally, get the last word. Of course, Wolfe said, closing his eyes. The brownstone settled again into its sacred quiet. Orchids tended, beer poured, Fritz content in the kitchen. Outside, New York pulsed with its usual chaos, but inside, order had been restored. The case of the broken glass had ended not with blood on the floor, but with truth refracted through shards, and for once, the body it hid was not flesh but deceit. And as always, Wolfe sat immovable in his chair, full of veal and victory, while I took the notes that proved once again that the biggest battles could be fought without lifting a finger, provided you had the mind and the appetite of Nero Wolfe. The days that followed slid back into routine, though routine in the brownstone is a relative thing. Fritz reclaimed his kitchen with the serenity of a general returning to familiar terrain. Theodore fussed upstairs with the orchids as though blossoms had been waiting for news of justice, and Wolfe resumed his daily rhythm with the serenity of a man who had no need to pursue the world because the world inevitably dragged its mess to him. But for me, the case hadn't quite finished breathing. There was still the matter of aftermath, the way people reshuffle themselves once the truth comes out and the lights switch off. Miss Vale called once, her voice steadier than I had heard it before. She said the board had not dismissed her, though she had offered her resignation. Croft, wary of scandal, had insisted she stay. "We need you more than ever," the director had told her, which Vale translated to me as, "We cannot afford another witness walking away." She thanked Wolfe again, and in the way her voice caught, I could tell gratitude wasn't a formality. It was oxygen. Blanche sent word through the Institute's channels that he would be taking leave. Whether it was voluntary or under pressure didn't matter. He was out, and I doubted he'd be rehired by any gallery that valued its glass intact. Whitaker, I learned from Vale, had retreated into academic papers, muttering about his authority. His kind usually survives by convincing themselves they were right all along. Croft stayed in her post, battered but unbowed, the kind of administrator who knew survival was less about clarity than momentum. And Felicia Crane. She stayed locked up long enough for Kramer to look satisfied, and Wolfe to look bored. She had confessed enough to make the district attorney's life easier, though her lawyers were already whispering about pressure and manipulation. Wolfe didn't care. Once the truth was named, the law could gnaw the bones. On the third evening after it all closed, I brought Wolfe his beer and sat across from him, watching the foam settle. "So that's it," I said. "No more shards, no more notes, no more hidden bodies. Just glass, donors, and one woman's reputation held together by your stubbornness." He tilted his head, eyes half closed. "Not stubbornness, Archie. Precision. Call it what you like. But Vale walked in here thinking she was finished, and she walked out intact. That counts." Wolfe let out a faint grunt, which for him passes as a hymn. Miss Vale is rare. Integrity often withers under pressure. Hers endured. That made her both the target and the solution. Without her, the ledger would have remained hidden, the pain merely glass. With her, the distortion was revealed. "Still," I said, "it could have been uglier. If Jabarian had pressed harder, if Crane had been smarter, if Eads had been louder." "If," Wolfe interrupted, "is a word for men who prefer fantasy. The facts are sufficient. They conspired. They faltered. They were exposed. That is the natural sequence." I leaned back, smiling. "You make it sound as inevitable as the seasons." "It is inevitable," he said, eyes closing again. "Falsehood fractures itself. My task is merely to notice where the cracks run." We sat in silence then, the kind that only Wolfe can make feel complete. Outside, New York clattered and shouted, but inside the brownstone the air was steady, warm and heavy with the smell of Fritz's latest experiment. The storm had passed, The glass had shattered, and the truth, however jagged, had been laid bare. I rose to fetch my hat, knowing tomorrow would bring another ring at the bell, another disturbance to Wolfe's ordered world. But tonight, at least, the house was whole again. Wolfe lifted his glass, his voice low but certain. "Archie, remember, glass may hide for a time, but it always reveals. So too with men." That was the last word, as it always is with him, and I let it stand, because in that chair, in that house, with that mind, it was true.